Rain pressed its thin, relentless fingers against the tall windows of Whitcombe House, blurring the lamplight into trembling halos that quivered like uncertain promises. Inside, beneath the crystal blaze of chandeliers, London's most discerning voices rose and fell in polite laughter, each syllable sharpened by curiosity. It had been 6 weeks since Lady Eleanor Whitcombe became a wife, and 6 weeks since she discovered she was to become a mother. Yet tonight she stood alone in the corridor beyond the ballroom, one gloved hand resting against the silk of her abdomen as though shielding a secret flame from the wind. Eleanor possessed the kind of beauty that did not beg to be admired but compelled quiet attention. Pale gold hair arranged in disciplined coils, gray eyes luminous with thought, and a mouth inclined toward restraint rather than display. She had not married for spectacle. She had married for devotion. At least, that was the hope she carried down the aisle beneath white roses and watchful eyes. Lord Henry Whitcombe had seemed solemn that day, grave in his vows, his dark gaze steady upon her as though memorizing a truth too delicate to speak aloud. In the weeks since, he had been courteous, unfailingly respectful, and curiously distant. He touched her hand as one might touch porcelain, careful not to mar it, careful not to claim it. Society interpreted this reserve as refinement. Eleanor felt it as winter. The ballroom doors stood ajar behind her now, and the music drifted into the corridor in softened strains of violin and pianoforte. She had excused herself with a practiced smile, citing a headache that was not entirely untrue. The physician's quiet confirmation that morning still echoed in her thoughts. 6 weeks. A life no larger than a whisper, and already it altered the architecture of her heart. She intended to return to the ballroom. She intended to wear her composure like armor. But as she approached the study at the corridor's end, she heard her husband's voice through the partially closed door. It was not raised in anger. It was not softened in affection. It was measured. "I cannot love her." 5 words, spoken with deliberate clarity. The world did not shatter. It narrowed. Eleanor did not breathe. The rain's percussion grew louder, as though the sky itself pressed closer to hear what followed. But no elaboration came swiftly enough to mend the wound. Another male voice murmured something indistinct, likely his longtime confidant, Mr. Ashcroft, but she heard only the echo of those 5 words reverberating through her ribs. "I cannot love her." Her hand slipped from her abdomen and found the cold wallpaper for support. The child within her, his child, suddenly felt less like a promise and more like a trespass. Had she mistaken kindness for devotion? Had her quiet admiration blinded her to reluctance? She recalled their courtship, brief, observant, dignified. Henry had asked thoughtful questions. He had listened. He had chosen her swiftly, decisively, as though afraid delay might steal her away. Yet perhaps choice was not the same as love. Inside the study a chair shifted. Glass touched wood. Henry's voice resumed, lower now, but she dared not remain to gather fragments that might slice more deeply. Dignity demanded retreat. She turned, each step measured, refusing the urge to flee. When she re-entered the ballroom, conversation faltered for a heartbeat before resuming in cultivated waves. Eleanor felt their glances skim across her like thrown petals, light, perfumed, insincere. She accepted a glass of watered champagne she would not drink. Across the room, Henry stood tall beside the mantel, dark hair immaculately parted, his posture composed. He did not yet see her. How easily he occupies the world, she thought. How easily I misread it. A matron whispered behind a feathered fan, and Eleanor caught her own name carried upon the current of speculation. The marriage had been swift, the alliance advantageous. There had been murmurs of ambition, of calculation. No one had accused Henry of tenderness. He saw her then. Their gazes met across the gilded distance. For a moment something flickered in his expression, concern, perhaps, or inquiry, but it vanished behind civility. He crossed the room with measured strides. "You look pale," he observed quietly. "Shall I summon the carriage?" His tone was gentle, infuriatingly gentle. "No," she replied, matching his restraint. "The air will suffice." His hand hovered near her elbow but did not quite touch. "As you wish." There it was again, that careful distance, that invisible pane of glass. She searched his face for cruelty and found none. She searched for regret and found only composure. If he did not love her, he bore it with astonishing grace. A waltz began. Couples turned in synchronized elegance. Henry extended his hand, the gesture impeccable. She placed her gloved fingers in his, and they joined the current of silk and satin. His palm was warm, his grip steady. To any observer they were harmony embodied. "You are unwell," he murmured, guiding her through the steps. "I am quite well," she answered. A lie wrapped in lace. As they revolved beneath the chandeliers, Eleanor felt the fragile shift within herself. Something tender had folded inward. Not shattered, no, she would not grant him that power, but rearranged. Love, she realized, could survive unreturned. Pride could not. When the dance concluded, she withdrew her hand first. Later, in the quiet of her bedchamber, she dismissed her maid and removed the diamond comb from her hair. The rain persisted, tracing silver paths down the glass. On her dressing table lay a small parcel she did not recognize, tied with understated ribbon. No note accompanied it. She hesitated only a moment before untying the bow. Inside rested a delicate silver music box, its surface engraved with subtle precision. Her breath caught as she read the initials carved beneath the lid, H.W. With trembling fingers she turned the key. A lullaby drifted into the room, soft, haunting, unmistakably tender. Eleanor pressed her palm once more to her abdomen, and for the first time that night, uncertainty trembled beside something else entirely, doubt. Morning arrived with a brittle clarity that made the events of the previous evening feel less like a nightmare and more like a verdict. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Whitcombe House, illuminating dust motes that drifted in the air like unsettled whispers. Eleanor sat upright in her bed, the silver music box resting closed upon her lap, its presence both comfort and accusation. She had not slept. Each time her eyes surrendered, she heard those 5 words again, steady and unembellished, as though etched into the marrow of her bones. Downstairs, preparations were already underway for the garden reception long scheduled in her honor. It would not do for the new Lady Whitcombe to retreat into illness after hosting half of London's discerning elite the night before. Society possessed a predatory instinct for weakness. It scented fracture the way hounds scented blood. Eleanor dressed with deliberate care, choosing a gown of pale blue silk that softened her pallor and arranging her expression into a serenity she did not feel. When she descended into the garden, a murmur rose like wind through reeds. Ladies beneath parasols assessed her with quick, darting glances. Gentlemen bowed with exaggerated courtesy. At the center of the lawn, Lord Henry Whitcombe stood among a cluster of parliamentarians, his posture assured, his dark coat immaculate. He looked every inch the rational architect of a successful union. Eleanor felt the child within her as a quiet, persistent truth. It was not yet movement, merely awareness. An inward pulse reminding her that whatever doubts shadowed her marriage, she did not stand alone. She accepted greetings, offered pleasantries, and endured the subtle tightening of smiles that suggested curiosity poorly disguised as civility. "Such a swift engagement," murmured Lady Carrington beside the rose arbor. "Romantic, no doubt." "Or strategic," replied another, her fan concealing the suggestion while amplifying its intent. Eleanor inclined her head as though the breeze, not their insinuations, had brushed her ear. Pride was a discipline, and she had always excelled at discipline. The arrival of Miss Beatrice Ashford fractured the fragile equilibrium. She entered the garden in a gown of ivory lace so severe it bordered on bridal, her dark hair arranged in artful simplicity. Beatrice carried herself with the assurance of one accustomed to admiration, and the subtle pause in conversation signaled her influence. She had long been rumored as a suitable match for Henry before Eleanor's unexpected ascent. "Lady Whitcombe," Beatrice greeted, her smile as precise as embroidery. "Marriage becomes you." "You are gracious," Eleanor replied evenly. Beatrice's gaze flickered, sharp and assessing. "I trust you find the responsibilities agreeable. Some unions require adjustment." The words settled between them like a glove thrown without spectacle. Eleanor felt heat rise in her chest but refused the indulgence of visible injury. "Adjustment," she said softly, "is merely another name for growth." Henry approached then, drawn perhaps by instinct or tension. He offered Beatrice a restrained nod before turning his attention to his wife. "The sun is harsh," he observed. "You ought not to stand so long." There it was again, concern expressed as caution, intimacy disguised as propriety. Before Eleanor could respond, a gentleman raised a glass to call for attention. "To Lord Whitcombe," he proclaimed, voice carrying easily across the manicured lawns. "May his recent marriage prove as advantageous in affection as it is in alliance." Laughter rippled, light but edged. The implication hovered unmistakably. Affection and alliance were not synonymous. Eleanor felt the ground tilt, her vision momentarily narrowing. A sudden wave of dizziness swept through her, the morning air thinning to something fragile and insufficient. She steadied herself, but the effort proved inadequate. Henry was at her side before she could fully falter. His hand closed firmly around her waist, not tentative now but decisive. Gasps fluttered through the assembly at the intimacy of the gesture. "You are faint," he said quietly, his voice stripped of performance. "Lean on me." "I require no spectacle," she murmured. "You require support." He did not release her. For one suspended moment, the world receded. She felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her gloved palm. His touch was not porcelain careful, it was resolute. The garden, the whispers, the rivalry, all blurred into irrelevance beneath the undeniable fact of his presence. He guided her to a shaded bench, dismissing inquiries with cool authority. "My wife's well-being is not a matter for discussion," he stated, tone unyielding. "Enjoy the roses." The rebuke, though elegantly phrased, carried steel. Beatrice's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Eleanor regained her composure, though her pulse remained unsettled. "You risk offense," she said once they were momentarily alone. "I risk nothing I cannot bear," he replied. His gaze lingered upon her with an intensity that unsettled more deeply than distance ever had. She searched his features for insincerity and found none. Yet memory intruded mercilessly. "I cannot love her." "You need not trouble yourself," she said carefully. "I would not impose." A shadow crossed his face, quick, unreadable. "You do not impose, Eleanor." The certainty in his voice contradicted the certainty she carried in her wound. Before she could challenge him, a footman approached discreetly and handed Henry a small leather-bound volume. "For her ladyship," the servant said. Henry turned the book in his hand, then extended it toward Eleanor. "This arrived by special courier." She accepted it with measured fingers. It was a first edition of Tennyson, its spine uncreased, its pages scented faintly of ink and promise. Inside the cover, written in familiar script, were the words, "For the bravest heart in this house." Her breath caught. "Did you send this?" she asked, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. Henry regarded her steadily. "Does it matter who sent it?" "It matters why." A pause lengthened between them, charged with unsaid things. "Because courage deserves acknowledgement," he answered at last. The simplicity of his reply unsettled her more than denial would have. Courage implied knowledge. Knowledge implied awareness. Did he know of the child? Did he suspect her frailty carried more than exhaustion? Across the lawn, Beatrice watched with narrowed interest, her composure now edged with calculation rather than charm. Eleanor felt the delicate threads of scandal tightening, weaving a narrative not of romance but of rivalry. Henry rose, offering his hand once more. "Shall we return?" he asked quietly. Eleanor looked at the book, then at the man who stood before her, so measured in public, so impenetrable in private. The music box's lullaby echoed in her memory, tender and unmistakably intentional. She placed her hand in his. As they stepped back into the sunlight, she realized the battle before her was no longer solely about love. It was about truth, about discovering whether the man who steadied her in daylight was the same man who had condemned her in shadow. The storm arrived just after dusk, rolling over London with a low, sovereign growl that rattled the windows of Whitcombe House and sent servants hurrying to secure the shutters. Lightning fractured the sky into brief, merciless brightness, illuminating the portraits of Whitcombe ancestors that lined the upper gallery, men who had worn duty like armor and women who had mastered silence as survival. Eleanor stood alone in the library, the first edition of Tennyson resting closed upon the escritoire, the silver music box beside it like a quiet accomplice. The fire cast uncertain light across the Persian rug, its warmth unable to dispel the chill coiling within her. She had asked to see her husband. Not as hostess. Not as ornament. As wife. Henry entered without haste, closing the heavy oak door behind him with a measured click that seemed to seal the room from the world beyond. He had removed his coat, and the absence of it rendered him less public, more human. His dark hair was slightly disordered by wind, a detail that unsettled her more than immaculate composure ever had. "You wish to speak," he said. The thunder answered before she could. "Yes." The word trembled only once. 4 weeks she had worn dignity like lacquer, polished and unyielding. Tonight it felt brittle. She moved toward the hearth, drawing strength from its glow, and turned to face him fully. "I believe I deserve clarity." His gaze sharpened, not in defense but in attention. "You have always had it." "No," she replied softly. "I have had courtesy." Lightning flashed, etching his features into sharp relief. He did not interrupt. "I heard you," she continued. "In the study. The night of the dinner. I heard what you said." A silence followed, dense and anticipatory. "You said," she pressed, forcing steadiness into her tone, that you could not love me. The words hovered between them, fragile and lethal. For a heartbeat he did not move. Then something shifted in his expression. Not guilt, not irritation, but something closer to regret. He exhaled slowly as though releasing a burden long held. You heard 5 words, he said. I heard enough. No, his voice was firmer now though not raised. You heard only what confirmed your fear. Her composure splintered. What else was I meant to hear? He crossed the room, not hastily but with intention, stopping just within reach. The sentence did not end there. The storm battered the windows, urging revelation. I said, he continued, that I could not love you as society commands. Eleanor blinked, confusion threading through the hurt. What does that mean? It means, he replied, his voice deepening with restrained intensity, that I will not offer you a careful affection designed to appease observers. I will not love you cautiously or conveniently, or in a manner that keeps my reputation pristine. The fire snapped sharply, punctuating his words. I cannot love you quietly, he finished. I refuse to. The confession altered the air itself. She stared at him, the wound she had carried beginning to fracture under a different weight. You spoke as though you regretted marrying me. He shook his head once, decisive. I married you because you possess a courage this house has long forgotten. Courage? She echoed faintly. You endure their scrutiny without bitterness. You answer condescension with grace. You walk into rooms that expect you to fail and you do not. His gaze softened, though its intensity did not diminish. Do you believe I chose you for alliance? I do not know what to believe. Thunder rolled again, less violent now, more distant. There are expectations upon my name, he continued. Political alliances. Marriages calculated to secure influence. I was urged toward Miss Ashford because it would have been simple. Eleanor's breath tightened. But simplicity has never compelled me, he said. You do. The word struck deeper than the earlier wound. You kept your distance, she whispered. You treated me as though I were porcelain. Because I feared my enemies would seek to wound me through you. She felt the truth of it in the steadiness of his tone. And so you wounded me yourself? His jaw tightened. I misjudged what silence would cost. The admission was quiet, unadorned, devastatingly sincere. For a long moment neither spoke. The storm began to ease, rain softening against the glass like an exhausted apology. There is something more, he said at last. A new tension threaded through her. I know about the child. Her heart stilled. The physician informed me this morning, he continued, his voice gentler than she had ever heard it. I would have preferred you tell me, but I understand why you did not. Emotion surged unexpectedly, fierce and protective. It was mine to guard. It is ours, he corrected softly. The firelight reflected in his eyes, revealing not calculation but resolve. He stepped closer, close enough that she felt the warmth of him without being touched. If you carry my child, he said, each word deliberate, then you must also carry my certainty. You were chosen, Eleanor. Not tolerated. The statement reverberated through her, dismantling weeks of quiet despair. Tears threatened, but she refused them. This moment required strength, not collapse. I feared I had bound you unwillingly, she confessed. You have bound me, he answered. But not unwillingly. A fragile, unfamiliar hope unfolded within her, tentative as spring after frost. The conflict that had defined her nights began to reshape itself, not vanished but clarified. Then, as though summoned by fate's perverse timing, a sharp knock struck the library door. Henry's expression shifted, vigilance replacing vulnerability. A servant entered, pale and hesitant. My lord, forgive the intrusion. A note has arrived from Mr. Ashford. It is urgent. Henry accepted the folded paper. His eyes moved swiftly across its contents, and whatever he read hardened his features into something formidable. What is it? Eleanor asked. He looked at her, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw anger, not reckless but cold and purposeful. It appears, he said quietly, that Miss Ashford has chosen to speak publicly of matters that are not hers to disclose. The storm had passed outside, but within the house a new tempest gathered, one not of misunderstanding but of deliberate malice. Eleanor felt her hand drift instinctively to her abdomen. Let them speak, she said, though uncertainty flickered beneath her resolve. Henry folded the note once, precisely. They will, he replied. And I will answer. The fire burned lower, casting long shadows across the walls, and in their shifting shapes Eleanor understood that clarity did not guarantee peace, it merely illuminated the battlefield ahead. The rumor did not creep through London, it arrived with intention. By noon the following day, folded notes passed between gloved hands, and gentlemen paused mid-conversation when Eleanor's name was spoken. By evening, the insinuation had acquired polish. Lady Whitcombe's delicate condition had preceded her vows. The implication was mercilessly clear. She had secured her marriage not with affection, but with necessity. Eleanor read the accusation in the altered cadence of greetings when she entered the parliamentary reception at Lancaster House. The chandeliers blazed overhead, scattering light across polished marble floors, but the brilliance felt interrogative rather than celebratory. Silk rustled like dry leaves as society assembled in careful formations, every smile sharpened by curiosity. Henry stood at her side, immaculate in black, his posture composed but charged with restrained force. He had insisted she accompany him despite her protest. "Retreat," he had said quietly, "will be mistaken for admission." She had recognized the truth in that. Now she felt the weight of 100 glances assessing the curve of her figure for confirmation of scandal. She carried herself upright, chin steady, though the child within her seemed suddenly exposed to the cruelty of speculation. Miss Beatrice Ashford lingered near the orchestra, radiant in silver satin, her expression touched with theatrical sympathy. When her gaze met Eleanor's, it held neither apology nor hesitation, only calculation. The evening advanced with brittle civility until Mr. Ashford himself requested the floor. Conversation subsided at once. His political influence ensured obedience. He spoke in measured tones about honor, lineage, and the preservation of reputation, each word crafted to appear principled while concealing venom. "There are moments," he concluded, "when a gentleman must consider whether duty has been manipulated under the guise of devotion." The silence that followed was not confusion. It was anticipation. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. This was the culmination of whispered conjecture, now dressed as moral concern. If Henry remained silent, the insinuation would calcify into belief. If he denied her publicly, his career would remain intact. For a suspended heartbeat he did nothing. Then he stepped forward. The movement was unhurried, yet it parted the assembly like a blade through silk. He did not raise his voice, he did not require to. "If there is manipulation present this evening," Henry began, his tone even and resonant, "it lies not in my marriage, but in the presumption that it requires justification." A murmur rippled outward. "My wife's condition," he continued, each syllable deliberate, "is not a matter for public arbitration." Mr. Ashford inclined his head with feigned patience. "Then you deny the irregularity?" Henry's gaze did not waver. "I deny nothing except your authority to question her honor." The orchestra fell silent entirely. Eleanor stood motionless, the enormity of his stance unfolding in real time. To defend her ambiguously would have been safer. To evade would have been strategic. He did neither. "You speak of duty," Henry said, turning slightly so his voice carried to the edges of the hall. "Permit me to clarify mine. My duty is not to gossip, nor to convenience, nor to alliances that profit at the expense of truth. My duty is to the woman I chose." The word chosen struck like a bell. Gasps fluttered through the crowd. Beatrice's composure tightened, her fingers whitening around her fan. Henry extended his hand toward Eleanor, not as ornament but as equal. She hesitated only a fraction before placing her gloved fingers in his. "This child," he declared, "was prayed for before it was conceived. Its existence is neither accident nor entrapment, but blessing." The audacity of his candor stunned the room into breathless stillness. "And if any man here believes I was coerced," he added, his voice lowering to something colder, "I invite him to state so plainly." No one moved. Mr. Ashford's expression faltered, the certainty draining from his posture. He had expected evasion, perhaps reluctant admission. He had not anticipated defiance. Henry turned back to him. "You mistake gentleness for weakness, sir. My wife's dignity is not a bargaining chip in your political ledger." The rebuke landed with precision. It was not shouted, it was irreversible. Eleanor felt the tremor in her own body subside, replaced by a fierce and unfamiliar steadiness. The humiliation she had braced for did not materialize. Instead, she stood at the center of a moment that redefined her marriage before witnesses who would carry the memory far beyond these walls. Mr. Ashford attempted recovery. "You risk your position with such sentiment." "I risk nothing that requires the sacrifice of honor," Henry replied. The words cost him. She could see it in the tightening of his jaw, in the flicker of calculation relinquished. Influence would cool. Invitations would thin. Yet he did not retract a single syllable. Beatrice lowered her gaze at last. The tension broke not with applause but with subtle recalibration. Conversations resumed cautiously, alliances shifting in quiet acknowledgement that a line had been drawn. Henry guided Eleanor toward the terrace doors, granting her air without relinquishing her hand. The night beyond was crisp, the city humming at a distance. Lantern light gilded the outline of his profile, revealing both resolve and consequence. "You need not have done that," she said softly, though the words lacked conviction. "Yes," he answered simply. "I did." She studied him in the cool darkness, understanding dawning not as fragile hope but as certainty forged in risk. The man who had once seemed divided between public duty and private restraint had chosen decisively where he stood. Behind them, the reception continued, altered irreversibly. Eleanor placed her free hand over her abdomen, feeling not vulnerability but protection. Inside the hall, whispers persisted, but they had changed in timbre. They no longer questioned whether he loved her. They questioned what he would relinquish next.
Dawn broke over London with a pale, forgiving light, as though the city itself wished to soften what the previous night had set ablaze. Whitcombe House stood in composed silence, its tall windows reflecting a sky washed clean by rain. Yet within its walls, consequence stirred like a second heartbeat. Eleanor woke before the servants, before the carriages began their measured procession along the square. For the first time since her marriage, she did not reach instinctively for composure. She reached instead for memory, the sight of Henry standing before a hall of scrutinizing eyes, declaring her chosen. The word had not dimmed with sleep. It had rooted itself. She rose and crossed to the window, one hand resting over the subtle curve of her abdomen. The scandal had not vanished overnight. London would dissect it for weeks, perhaps months. Henry's political allies would reconsider their loyalties. Invitations might cool, opportunities might narrow. Love, she was discovering, was not merely sentiment. It was sacrifice in motion. A quiet knock preceded Henry's entrance. He did not wait for ceremony, he had abandoned that instinct between them. His expression carried fatigue but not regret. "You are awake," he observed gently. "So are you." He stepped into the morning light and for a moment neither spoke. The silence between them had transformed from barrier to understanding. "I received word at first light," he said at last. "There will be repercussions." "I expected as much." He studied her carefully. "You do not seem afraid." "I was," she admitted. "Yesterday. Before you spoke. And now. Now I understand the cost." He moved closer, not with urgency, but with intention that felt earned rather than assumed. "If that cost proves severe," he said quietly, "you must not imagine I will resent it." "I would never presume that," she replied. "But I will not have you ruined for my sake." His expression sharpened, not in anger but in clarity. "You are not a burden to be calculated, Eleanor." Before she could answer, a servant entered with discreet haste, bearing a sealed envelope marked with the royal crest. Both husband and wife stilled. Henry accepted it, breaking the wax with steady hands. His eyes moved swiftly across the contents and something unreadable flickered there, surprise, then measured contemplation. "Well?" Eleanor asked. He looked at her, and the tension that had shadowed him since the reception shifted into something steadier. "Her Majesty's private secretary requests my presence at Windsor this afternoon." The implications unfurled silently between them. Royal attention could signal censure, or commendation. Eleanor's pulse quickened. "Do you believe it a reprimand?" "I believe," he answered, folding the letter with deliberate care, "that integrity has a way of unsettling as many as it inspires." He departed before noon, leaving Eleanor alone with anticipation that stretched the hours thin. She occupied herself in the nursery room that had until now existed only in imagination. The walls were bare, the hearth unlit, yet she could almost hear the faint echo of the lullaby from the silver music box resting upon the mantel. She opened it once more. The melody filled the quiet space, tender and unwavering. It no longer felt like a question. It felt like promise. By late afternoon the sound of carriage wheels upon gravel sent her heart racing. She descended the staircase with measured steps, refusing the impulse to run. Henry entered the foyer still clad in travel dust, his expression grave yet illuminated by something she had not seen before, relief. "Well?" she breathed. He removed his gloves slowly as though savoring the moment before release. "Her Majesty does not concern herself with gossip," he said evenly. She concerns herself with character. Eleanor held his gaze, searching for what he withheld. I have been offered a reassignment, he continued. A diplomatic post. Less visible in Parliament. More autonomous. The words were neither triumph nor defeat. They were transition. Is it exile? She asked softly. It is opportunity, he replied. An acknowledgement that conviction has value. Understanding dawned in her chest like sunrise breaking through lingering storm. He had not been punished. He had been repositioned. And the Ashfords? She pressed. He allowed himself the faintest curve of satisfaction. Their petitions for favor have been quietly declined. The tension that had bound her ribs for weeks dissolved in a single exhale. You risked everything, she said. I risked reputation, he corrected gently. Not everything. He stepped closer until only inches separated them. Everything stands before me. The simplicity of the statement undid her more thoroughly than any grand declaration could have. This was not the distant man who had once guarded himself behind restraint. This was a husband who had chosen vulnerability in public and consequence in private. She lifted her chin, meeting him not as supplicant but as equal. Then let us not waste what has been won. His hand rose, brushing a strand of hair from her temple with reverence rather than possession. You feared I could not love you, he murmured. I feared you would not. I told you once that I would not love you quietly. His voice lowered, steady and unashamed. Permit me to amend it. She waited. I love you without caution. The confession did not thunder, it resonated. It carried the weight of action already taken, of sacrifice already made. Tears gathered despite her discipline, but they did not fall from weakness. They fell from release. Behind them the house felt altered, not grander but warmer. The nursery upstairs no longer represented uncertainty. It represented continuation. Henry's hand settled over hers where it rested against her abdomen. The gesture was neither protective nor symbolic, it was shared. Our child, he said softly as though testing the shape of the phrase in open air. Our child, she echoed. Outside, the city resumed its rhythm, indifferent yet irrevocably changed in their private world. Society would continue to whisper, ambition would continue to tempt, trials would return in different disguises. Yet the fracture that had begun with 5 devastating words had been mended not by denial, but by courage. The silver music box began its melody again upstairs, stirred by the faint vibration of movement. Its lullaby drifted down the staircase like benediction. Eleanor leaned into her husband, not because she required support, but because she desired proximity. He bent his head, pressing a kiss to her brow, solemn, deliberate, sealing rather than seeking. In the quiet that followed, there was no longer any doubt of what had been chosen. Only what they would build.